Howdy, and welcome to Gen Edge Live, the first of what will be an occasional series of Zoomcasts that brings Gen right down to business. I'm Alex Philippidis, joined today by two of my Gen colleagues, Kevin Davies, our editor-at-large, and John Sterling, Gen's editor-in-chief for more than 30 years. Gen is short for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News, in case you're new to Gen. It's the world's first publication devoted exclusively to biotech and the life sciences, and we're celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. And one of the ways we're celebrating is by delving a little deeper into the industry wrought by biotech and the life sciences. And we'll do that with the help of our special guests today. We're welcome to Gen Edge Live, Charmaine Chan, a PhD and CFA, who's a senior analyst with Cambiar Investments, and Brad Loncar, CEO of Loncar Investments. We'll get to Brad and Charmaine in a few moments. Meanwhile, we welcome you to Gen Edge Live. Thank you for taking the time to be part of the show. You're welcome to send us questions as you have them through the Q&A button on your Zoom on the bottom of your screen. We'll read and have our guests respond to as many of them as time permits. Kevin?
Alex, thank you very much, and congratulations on hosting this inaugural episode of Gen Edge Live. You've done more than anyone to bring this Gen Edge entity into fruition. For those of you who don't know, Gen Edge is the new premium content tier of Gen, which we've been quietly building over the past year. While Gen offers you the latest in biotech science and technology news through its free magazine and regularly updated website, Gen Edge takes you to the bleeding edge of the business of biotechnology, offering exclusive and insightful news and analysis about companies and in-depth interviews with the people who are really moving those companies and advancing the technology. You can open your account at Gen Edge with a 60-day free trial, and if we fail to deliver, please just cancel at any time, no questions asked. When you sign up, you'll have instant access to a trove of more than 100 stories and interviews that have been accumulating over the past year, most of them written by our host today, and surely worth your time. And over the course of this year, we're going to be adding more of these sorts of multimedia events, web shows, hangouts, podcasts, and many other things besides, hopefully culminating in an absolutely bang-up 40th anniversary celebration of our parent magazine. You can find more details and register at Gen Edge, at Gen's website, genengenews.com, genengenews.com. Alex, back to you.
Thanks, Kevin. And speaking of Gen, over the years, Gen's specialty areas of coverage or pillars have grown to bioprocessing, cancer, drug discovery, omics, translational medicine, and genome editing. Those specialties have spawned a global biotech industry that's expected to double in value in this decade, from $448 billion just before the pandemic to a projected $833 billion by 2027. That estimate according to Fior Markets. The size and strength of the industry were evident at the virtual JP Morgan 39th Healthcare Conference earlier this month, where 335 companies gave presentations. Today, we'll look at some of the news that came out of JP Morgan, from mergers and acquisitions to partnerships and other key announcements, and shed some light on where biopharma and many of its key players are headed in the new year, with help from today's guests. Charmaine Chan began her investment career at RBC Capital Markets and later worked at Arrowpoint Partners before joining Cambiar in 2016. Brad Loncar has created two NASDAQ-listed biotech-focused exchange-traded funds and previously worked at Franklin Templeton Investments and was appointed to serve in a senior advisor role at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Charmaine and Brad, can you begin by telling us a little bit about a little more on yourselves and your organizations?
Sure, I'll start. And so it's first of all, it's an honor to be here. And when I was a grad student, I actually read Gen Ed magazine, so it comes full circle. So such an honor. So yeah, I mean, I guess I would have a conventional career path at this point. After grad school, I wanted to do business, so I started on the sell side and worked at RBC as a sell side analyst for 4.5 years, and then now I'm a buy side investor both at Arrowpoint, they renamed to Arrowmark, and now at Cambiar. Cambiar, we're a long only relative value fund, and I occupy this awesome seat of being able to look at any healthcare company under the sun, like all market caps, all subsectors, all geographies. And so, like you said, Alex, about how the explosion of the industry in terms of investor interest, and that's what we're channeling, right? It's trying to invest capital in productive companies that are going to change either the disease paradigm or how drugs are made or how care is delivered. So that's what we do as investors at Cambiar.
Brad?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. And happy 40th anniversary. That's an amazing milestone. So I'm a biotech investor. I've been doing it full time for 13, 14 years and kind of part-time my whole life. I'm actually a finance guy. I don't have a science degree. I always loved biology, but hated chemistry. So I switched from pre-med to finance when I was in college and never looked back. But I've always tried to kind of marry biotech and investing, because I think that investing in biotech is like the most impactful thing you can do in the stock market. And I think it's a lot of fun. And I think that the next couple decades ahead of us are really going to be biology's decade. And the goal of my business, I create what are called ETFs. So ETFs are like mutual funds, but they trade on the stock exchange. And I have one that focuses on immuno-oncology and one that focuses on China. And I hope to launch even more in the future. And the goal of that business is to make biotech investing more inclusive, to put together products that help more people invest in these amazing technologies that we have in our industry today. And so I love, I love being a biotech investor, and it's great to be with you today. I always make a point to meet with Alex at the actual JPM. And I'm sorry that we couldn't do that in person this year, but it's great to have the chance to participate in this webinar. So thank you.
Yeah, I remember meeting you at a cafe on Market Street a couple of years ago, reading JP Morgan there, and look forward to the day we can do that again. I have a sense, one thing, what got you interested in biotech? Obviously, I know that you veered away from chemistry, Brad, but what got you interested and keeps you interested in biotech?
Yeah, I actually had a biology in high school. I had a biology teacher who had a huge impact on my life. It was my favorite subject, and I'm a little bit of a science nerd, as well as a finance person. And so I actually started pre-med in college. And as I said, I loved biology, but I hated chemistry. And so in my college, pre-med was kind of a weed out major, and I got weeded out. But I've always stuck with it. And I actually I kind of specialize in oncology. And, to me, that's like one of the most important things you can invest in. And the science of oncology, I think over the last, decade or two has been where it's at in our sector. And so just, going to the ASCOs and ASHs every year for the last, decade or so to see how oncology has transformed from, being a very incremental industry to, now what we have with targeted therapies and immuno-oncology and now cell therapy. To see that unfold and to be able to participate in that and to invest in companies and get to know the scientists and executives at these companies that are making that happen, to me is just the most exciting thing that you could possibly be around. So if I can take my talents as an investor and put it towards something like that, I just think that that's the ultimate thing that a person can do in the stock market.
Charmaine?
I think my attraction to investments, and that's the question that I get a lot from some of my younger colleagues, is how to transition out of the academic world into business. And the standard paths are you either do consulting or you become an industry scientist. They're phenomenal. The people who started their own companies after grad school. I think like Afria is one of them. I met her at JP Morgan. Well, I met her at this virtual conference, and I think for me, it's with investments, just like Brad said, I think liking and appreciating science is one dimension, but being able to grind in and out every single day and being able to, dig a mile deep and be so passionate about one topic, that takes a different personality. My older brother is actually a professor in theoretical math. And so I knew where the bar was and I knew where I wasn't. So I think, I need to transition myself to a slightly different role. And I think investments is, it is a privilege to have clients trust you with your capital, whether it's an ETF or a mutual fund. For us, we deal with institutional clients, but, it's people's savings. And, and with ESG mandates now, you want those investments to go into productive uses. Companies that are, like Brad said, creating new drugs, new paradigms, that actually, benefit society, but at the same time generate a good risk-adjusted returns for our investors.
I'll add, I'll just interject with one other thing that I love about this sector is that I think if you truly do your homework and really get to understand the science and get to understand the companies, more than any other sector, you can actually have a true edge as an investor. If I'm investing in Coca-Cola, there's literally 1 million people that know more about it than I do. There's no way I can have an edge. I can say that, there's cancer companies that I've done so much research on, getting to know the science and getting to understand the company, that I'm in the top, 5 or 6 people who, know, actually really understand and know that company. And because it's such a technical sector, if you understand the science and really do a thorough job in your due diligence, you can have an edge over the rest of the market because not a lot of people, really understand some of these companies, I think.
Wow. As we sit here nearly a month into 2021, with a State of the Union address usually delivered around this time, late January, very beginning of February, this time each year. Let's borrow from that a little bit and ask, what would you say is the state of biopharma today, Charmaine and Brad?
I think the state of biopharma, I would concur 100% with Brad. It's a very exciting landscape. I think I'm amazed every single year when I go back to JP Morgan, so sort of just like the progress that each of these companies have made. Like when you talk to them, I guess, with CAR T now, we don't just have CAR T with CAR, NK cells. And, before people thought that off the shelf was, a crazy concept. And now we're, making much more progress towards that potentially being true and, applying that from, not just blood cancers, but to solid tumors. And so that's just one example. And then another example would, and you guys are experts on some of this, like Kevin, like, synthetic biology and being, applied to not just tools and diagnostics, but, agriculture, food, advances, to medicine. And it every single year, it feels like the progress is much faster. And it's hard to keep up as investors. So I would say, the state of it is just very vibrant. The speed is accelerating. I think there's more investors are interested in the space, like from more generalist backgrounds to more specialized backgrounds. And it's just a very dynamic, vibrant investment environment.
Brad?
Last year was really a pivotal year for our industry in a very ironic, weird way. We had this tragic COVID event, but it was really an inflection point for our industry. I like to say that last year was the year that biotech went mainstream, at least from a stock market perspective. Biotech has always been a niche. And, as a biotech investor, one thing that's been frustrating over the years is we have all of these game-changing technologies that we all know about as biotech people, gene editing, immuno-oncology, like you could go down the line. But a lot of people don't know about them. You see a Tesla driving down the street, or you use a social media app. So everyone understands, tech and other sectors of the stock market. But, with COVID, our industry was on the front page of every website and newspaper in the world every single day. And, everyone saw, it's amazing to think that something like messenger RNA is now a household term that everybody has heard. So people, I think, for the first time, are really seeing the general public and really appreciating some of these game-changing technologies that as biotech people, we've known about for a long time. And from a stock market perspective, and also like a VC perspective, money is just flowing into our sector. It was really a banner year as far as that goes. And I actually, that actually makes me a little nervous because we can talk about this later. Some valuations are very high right now. And I think we've really been spoiled by, the success of the vaccines, how quickly those mRNA vaccines were in and out of the clinic and succeeded with such high efficacy rates. So I hope we can live up to some of the high expectations that broader society generalists have put on this sector. But I think that we're going to have like a renaissance of investing in biotech for the years ahead. Number one, because technology is so strong fundamentally, but number two, everyone has seen how integral our sector is to the normal functioning of society. And so you're going to have not just individual investors, but governments, all around the world really investing in biotech because this sector is so important, and everybody gets that now after this tragic year that we've had last year.
Yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit later on, as you said, on VC and valuations. But John, I want to bring you into this because I know you've been following the pandemic
Sure.
as well as we have.
First of all, listening to you, Alex, and Brad and Charmaine talk about where the industry is at now. When I started in the mid 80s, every time a gene was cloned, it would be page one. Now we have the Human Genome Project and CRISPR. The other thing was there was still, in the United States, but more so in Britain, I mean, should academic research go commercial? We just had Leroy Hood on last week, and he had to go to 16 different companies before Applied Biosystems would give him money for the automated sequencer and synthesizer, without which it'd be no Human Genome Project. So it's just, looking back over the years, it's just amazing how far this area came. And Charmaine, you're talking about synthetic biology. I learned late last year that it's actually impacting the world of fashion. Is going into that. And we'll be doing something like that on the line. So yeah, it is an exciting industry. People say, why have you been doing this so long? Exactly because of that. There's always something new. Although we definitely could have done without the pandemic. But I wanted to both of you. So speaking about the pandemic, things happen so fast. And Brad, you were saying how, messenger RNA and biotech is now, in the local colloquium now. What has been learned by the biopharma industry's rapid response to the pandemic in terms of new drugs and vaccines, what they did, and how can that be applied to development of novel therapeutics in the future? I mean, is this opening up doors both scientifically and from a regulatory point of view, either one?
I would say, biopharma executives, generally, the bigger the market cap, the company is, the more risk adverse you are. And that's just by nature of the fact that investor expectations are different, right? Like, when you look at a mega cap pharma company, we want a certain trajectory of top line growth. We want margins to improve every year. And so, then they get siloed into saying that I only have so much R&D budget. And these are my blockbuster drugs that I have to evergreen and keep the life cycle going. So they're by nature more risk adverse. And then obviously the biotechs are much more risk seeking because, it's like, it's a paradigm change, right? You're going broke or go big or go broke, right? I think the pandemic changes up everyone's risk profile, risk tolerance a lot, because they, in the back of their heads, they recognize that this is not just about generating returns. This is about, actually helping like humankind, right? In a way, like, so I think, that allows them to take more risk from an intrinsic standpoint. And then clearly the regulatory side is much more amenable, right? We hear about EUA, emergency use authorizations across the board, not just for diagnostics, but even for Gilead's drug like remdesivir, and Lilly and Regeneron's cocktails of antibodies to help fight the pandemic. And so I think the regulatory agencies also recognize that, look, we have had this very stringent way of looking at drugs and looking at their safety and efficacy that is very well founded. Like, that is the way that drug development should go. But, are we creating unnecessary hurdles sometimes for drugs to get to market? And the more competition there is, whether it's the same class of drugs, but now you have different companies coming in. That impacts pricing, right? Because then it impacts your leverage with insurance companies. If you're the only drug in the class, you're the only drug for that cancer indication, you could command a very, very high price. And and insurance companies on behalf of consumers don't have any leverage. And so the whole ecosystem, I think, the US stands for quality of drugs and safety of drugs, but there has to be a balance between how stringent these regulatory requirements are with how much risk the bioexecutives are willing to take, and then how much drugs and tools and diagnostics products we get in the end, and they're all linked. And so I think the pandemic has changed that, and I think Brad alluded to this. I think this is going to continue into the future, because now we know that things could be done in this way, right? Like the mRNA vaccines could be going from concept to approval in less than a year, like which is very, very impressive. In a normal environment, that will probably take years, if not a decade. So it's a huge change.
Brad?
Yeah, I would echo many of the things that Charmaine said. And, I think especially for vaccine development, now that we've seen it in the most urgent sense be a success, while I don't think all vaccines will be developed this quickly, I do think that it'll speed up the timelines. But, one thing I would caution about, as a biotech investor, one of the number one questions non-biotech people ask me is like, isn't the FDA too slow and take years and slow things down by decades? And I think that having a gold standard FDA is one of the most important things that allows us to have the world-class biotech sector that we have. And while I think it is important to be smart about regulation and having accelerated approvals and different pathways, and the things that we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years, I also think it's important that we keep that gold standard seal. I've seen during this pandemic, I've seen things from other regulators, the UK regulator, for example, that I think could really is not good for the industry. Like the AstraZeneca vaccine, there's nobody that can tell you with a straight face how efficacious that is with the dosing error that they've had. And they're just maybe for good reason, because this is such an emergency, but they're making decisions like, let's hold off on the second dose and they're making these things with very thin scientific reasoning behind them, I think. And so maybe that's appropriate during, a once in a generation, terrible event like we're going through. But I also think it's important that, the pendulum doesn't swing too far to the other side, because having a strong regulator actually, I think, is one of the best assets that our industry has. And so I would just caution not to go too far with some of it. And the last thing I'll say that I think will change drug development. Another thing that's had an inflection point this year, I think, is sequencing. Look how important sequencing has been to tracking the pandemic and how that's related to, how vaccines and the treatments have been developed. The variants are in the news right now. The fact that, there's so much sequencing going on out in the world, and that's a way that we're tracking this, is kind of something that's new and really had a positive impact on how we're going about this. So I think that this has been a big year for sequencing as it relates to drug development and regulation and things like that as well.
Okay. Before I turn over to Kevin, who's an expert on sequencing and other issues, but picking up on this pandemic, and you mentioned China before, the world has been virtually on lockdown for a year. How has this impacted, if at all, biotech companies' abilities to collaborate cross-border and other kinds of relationships? Has that been severely impacted? Charmaine?
I would say Brad probably has more expertise in having talked to more Chinese executives. So my family is from Macau, so I heard a lot about the pandemic like as early as January of last year, and I think I would say your question prompted me to go in that direction, because like I was thinking exactly like you did. I thought that, you know, the CROs, this you know, the contract research organizations might have had a tough time dealing with this, because how are you going to enroll patients when people, you know, don't want to come out of their house, right? Like, and the industry has just adopted phenomenally, right? Like a lot of you know, like digital trials being done, and very minor trial delays. So I think that speaks to some of, partially answers the question that you asked, is like, you know, has it impacted the ability of companies to collaborate? And I feel like it honestly, it hasn't, either from an executive point of view or from a logistics point of view. And I think the reason goes back to sort of, you know, like most people who are in the industry, they are motivated to do the right thing. And they, you know, this is such an emergency situation. People have workarounds, you know, whether it's manufacturing, or you know, trial enrollment, or relationships that they want to build, and then, you know, like what Brad mentioned, sequencing is the same thing. It's sort of, you know, that there were a lot of bottlenecks, you know, things that you didn't think about, like plastic bits, you know, swipes, you know, things like that. They're all very mundane nature that actually prohibited companies that were moving as fast as they can. But time and time again, every company that you talk to, they find ways around it, and, you know, and they were able to meet quotas, exceed quotas, and meet timelines. So yeah, I don't think there's that much of an impact, and the ability for them to adapt has truly been tremendous, and I would say surprised a lot of investors. You know, back in March and April, when we thought that, you know, a lot of these companies wouldn't be able to do business as usual and do well, and they happen to exceed them both on a revenue and a margin standpoint.
Thank you. Brad, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I would say that collaboration is being impacted in both positive and negative ways, and we have to be careful in both aspects how we move forward. So, for example, during the heat of COVID, you know, February and March of last year, when borders totally shut, you know, some countries, I think all countries actually, in many ways took a you know, everybody for themselves mentality. And so, you know, some not just with like PPE, but you saw some companies in our sector start to run out of API and other things like that. And so I think what's going to happen going forward is countries are going to view biotech as a national security asset. And you're going to see, number one, countries become protective of their own biotech sectors, which may be a bad thing because, you know, our industry is all about collaborating and sharing and all of that. But on a positive sense, you're also going to see a boom of investing in biotech all around the world. And, you know, a great example of this protectionism, I think, was the CureVac story, which I thought was one of the most interesting things that happened last year. There was an American CEO who almost cut a deal with the US government. He kind of got fired, and, you know, the German government infused that money with cash. And anyway, that's a long story, but you're starting to see governments in free economies actually, you know, directly, you know, help build and invest in biotech companies. That's really amazing. And China, before today, this is a whole other discussion, but the reason I'm so interested in China is for the last few years, there was essentially no biotech sector in China, and they are all in. They want to be not just self-sufficient, but globally competitive, because this is an industry of the future. And what COVID has done for China is really accelerated those plans just in like other countries in the world. So there's been a little bit, you know, of protectionism that maybe we have to be careful that politics doesn't take that too far. Some of it is understandable, but, you know, at the end of the day, our industry is about collaboration. But it is definitely a trend that you'll see, you know, more API makers, you know, being invested in and created in home geographies, so that if something like this happens again, countries will feel a little more self-sufficient, I think.
Great. Brad and Jordan, thank you very much. Kevin?
Great. You're on to Gen Edge Live. Me, Alex Philippidis, John Sterling, and Kevin Davies. Continuing.
Thanks, Alex. I want to slip in a couple of questions about CRISPR. I'm contractually obliged to do that. Brad, you used the term biology's decade, and CRISPR's had a phenomenal decade, of course, beginning with the seminal work of Dowden, Charpentier, and others, and culminating in the Nobel Prize in chemistry at the end of last year. I'd love to hear your views about the surging interest in genome editing, not just as a technology, but it's had a surge on the markets lately as well. And how bullish are you about the technology's clinical potential? Maybe Charmaine, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we first heard about CRISPR as investors, at least for me, probably 2015. That's when it hit the scene. And I think, we still have the same discussions about, is it how precise it is, like, can we get the products that we want without off-target side effects, and I think the technology itself has matured a little bit, but going back to from an investor point of view, if it's CRISPR with in a tools or diagnostic setting or in a food setting versus a drug setting, the risk premiums are different, and I think that most investors are comfortable with the concept, but the proof is in the pudding. So every time a company tells you whether it's like the beams of the world or the edits of the world, right, like you're like, okay, show me the data, and show me the durability of response, like show me that the fact that the safety is in fact there. So I would say, this is analogous to probably, CAR Ts, like, maybe they're 3 or 4 years behind. I think the learning curve is still really steep. Like, I feel like there's a lot that I don't understand. Like when I talk about these companies, every time they educate me and they tell me something, I'm like, oh, wow, that's a misconception that I have had because of a paper that I read, 5 years ago, and that's no longer true. So, but it's just, you could see, we can all as investors see the potential, and I guess, some investors, like if you buy into the whole ARC concept, right? Like they basically say, I don't know which of these stocks are going to win, and I just buy everything, right? Everything that is in the space, like the twist, like the edits of the world. So but I agree with you, Kevin. I mean, you're the expert in this area, so you're probably the most bullish out of the panel. But I agree with Brad in that in sort of just like that's our role as investors is to dig really deep, do your due diligence, and decide how much risk you're willing to take and invest accordingly.
Yeah, Brad, they've had a tremendous run up and they've given some gains back in the last few days or a week. But was there a specific trigger beyond the Nobel Prize that you could put your finger on and say that this is why there's been this new sort of investor interest in this space?
Yeah, Charmaine and I are exactly on the same page about this. So first of all, let's separate the science of CRISPR from CRISPR stocks. I couldn't be more bullish on the science of CRISPR. I'm a big believer that over the next 10 or 20 years, this is going to change medicine. So we're on the same page as far as that goes, but I do worry about the valuation. So this is a term that every generalist investor, every person out there has heard. So like for my ETF business, in a normal year, I visit financial advisors a lot, and I ring the doorbell. I'm Brad. I'm a biotech investor. And the first thing I hear is CRISPR. Tell me about CRISPR. What do you know about CRISPR? And the average person who's think of this year that we've had last year that's starting to invest in biotech for the first time is kind of under the impression that CRISPR is going to cure every disease in like the next 2 or 3 years. And they're just throwing money at these stocks. And Charmaine mentioned the term ARC. So there's a really successful ETF called the ARC Genome Etf that over the last 3 months of last year, to their credit, they're outstanding investment managers and stock pickers. This fund has brought in over $7 billion in the last 3 months. And all of that funnels into the CRISPR stocks because they're big CRISPR disciples as well. So I think that from a stock market perspective, they're all, in my opinion, overvalued. Like Beam, for example, that's a world-class company. The CEO, John Evans, is a friend of mine. I'm not criticizing him or the company in any way, but this is a company that's a year away from the clinic and has a $6 billion valuation. And one thing I worry about is all of the CRISPR companies essentially have the same pipelines. They're all starting with sickle cell disease and beta thalassemia. I'm actually skeptical that gene editing or even gene therapy approach will have a huge market for that, because you have to do the busulfan preconditioning, and it's a very intensive and expensive treatment. But anyway, as people in biotech, we know that the realization of CRISPR is going to take many, many years. And I think the people throwing money at these companies maybe don't appreciate that. So since we're talking about JPM, one of the biggest decliners of JPM was actually Editas, which is a world-class company, but it has a 5 to 7 billion valuation, and they showed their pipeline during their presentation, and it was beta thal sickle cell disease, and they're still years away from really going full steam ahead into those things. And I follow CAR T very closely, and they're all doing ex vivo, using CRISPR to edit CAR T cells. And that hasn't actually worked out very well, because, the CRISPR editing is great, but Aloe has a lot of challenges, the biology of allogeneic cells, and all the CRISPR magic in the world might not change that. So anyway, I'm a huge believer in the science. It sounds like Charmaine is too. But I worry that so much money has come into these stocks over such a short period of time that they are due for a much more significant
correction, as they say.
Yeah. And then maybe there'll be great opportunities, because I do believe in them in the long term.
Fascinating answers. Thank you so much. Alex, back to you. I know you've got a ton of questions, any of which we won't get to. We have some audience questions coming in as well.
Sure, and I think that might be a good time to bring in some of those audience questions. Okay. We thank you for being part of Gen Edge Live, as usual. And one of our audience members, Jerry, asks, there are many exciting companies and technologies, but the industry is very fragmented. To what degree do you think there will be consolidation in 2021? For both Brad and Charmaine.
So I think traditionally at JP Morgan, most investors go in and we talk a lot about like M&A announcements, or like protocol collaborations, or or the whole industry basically gives guidance, right? And at the beginning of the year, it sets the tone. And so I would say this year, on an M&A standpoint, and there are different types of M&A. Are you doing M&A for financial engineering reasons, which could be valid, right? You buy a company that has an established, mature, growing product, you cut out all the costs, take out the SG&A, take out the R&D, and suddenly it deserves a different, valuation. And when you tack it onto a bigger company whose growth might be slowing, you bolster, your investor credentials and base, right? So that's one type of M&A. I understand that the listener is asking for a different type of M&A, sort of more strategic, right? Like kind of if there's so many companies going after the same thing, are there complementary skill sets where if they merge, it would make sense. And I think you see that, but you also see the opposite, right? You see Bluebird actually splitting into two companies, oncology and rare diseases. I would say that's rare from that standpoint. Generally, consolidation in this space happens because, like I said, it's more from a financial perspective rather than from a capabilities standpoint, because these entrepreneurs, they start their biotechs precisely because they believe that they have something that is so unique and so special, right? And you want to see it till that readout happens, like be proven correct or wrong. There's probably 10 or 15 ADC companies out there, and antibody drug conjugate companies out there. And I don't see them merging because they think that I do really well with the warhead and you do really well with the linker, right? Like that's just kind of not how they think. But I think his or her observation is very valid, is that because science is moving at such a great pace, and universities, like John said, went from there's no way, right? You're either in academia or you're in industry, to now every major university has a licensing office, and there's just so much pipeline coming out, and people want to get there, and it has speed up the race, and it has not really incented companies to merge. It's just that there's more competitors out there now. I need to move even faster.
Okay. Brad, any thoughts one way or the other?
Yeah, I would just add by saying I hope it happens because, one interesting aspect of our industry right now is most of the next generation science like CRISPR is not happening in the big pharmaceutical companies. It's all small biotech companies that are making that happen. And I think that I really give a lot of credit to Pfizer, how they've partnered with Biotech over the last year and succeeded and are really at the forefront of an amazing science like that. And, they've really earned a lot of goodwill capital from the entire world. And I would love to see more big pharmaceutical companies placing large bets on some of those emerging technologies like Pfizer did. Now that they've seen, how successful it could be for one of their peers. So I hope so.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Ross weighs in with a question. Speaking of, I know, Brad, you mentioned Aloe immuno-oncology products. Ross asks, what real-world practical issues will likely slow the development of those off-the-shelf Aloe products?
Well, for sure, the biggest issue facing Aloe right now is persistence. Cell persistence and the durability of treatment. We've seen Aloe data, kind of at the last two ASHs, and you see very quick relapses of those patients. And, that's a problem that all of these companies are trying to solve, but it may actually be an unsolvable problem. It just may be the biology of this, that it's going to be hard for an Aloe treatment to match up against an autologous treatment. And maybe the place for Aloe will be certain, situations, when you've got to have it the next day or, something like that. So for sure, that's the biggest technical hurdle right now. They're going through some of the same safety issues, like the cytokine release syndrome that you see with traditional, auto CAR T. I think those things will be overcome just like the autologous products did, but cell persistence is a big one. And the last thing I'll say about this is almost all of the indications that CAR T in general, Aloe included, are going into right now. There's competition from T cell engagers, bispecifics and other modalities. And so I would say that, those treatments have a lot of competition, not just from auto CAR T, but from all areas of our industry right now. And so I think it's going to be a challenging field over the next year or two, just like it has been over the previous couple of years.
Charmaine?
Yeah, I think there's also a little bit of an angle of regulatory speaking, that they're more comfortable with autologous versus allogenic. And so, the dosing regimens that these companies can move forward in their trials is also slower. And so, that's not an issue in itself, right? But it's still that the agencies, investors are grappling with, safety and efficacy and sort of, waiting to see these data readouts and, how pure is this, right? You derive from a single cell line and then, you're doing modifications to it to bypass some of these concerns of, and so is what you think you have, the edited product, really what you really have, right? And can you manufacture it at scale? And so I think these technical issues or hurdles are getting solved, on a very fast-paced basis. But with this is still a wait and see approach, both from investors and from regulators. And so in the next 2 years, we should have a much clearer picture whether this would completely supplant autologous.
Great. And just sort of shifting gears a little bit, we are a few days into the new administration of President Joe Biden as we're recording this. What effect do you see the new administration having, if any, on the biotech and biopharma industry?
I would say, at least from my point of view, top of mind is clearly, is there more draconian drug pricing legislation that is going to come down the pipe? That's one thing. And the other thing about, healthcare access, right? I think President Biden has been very clear that he would build on the ACA, but he also has talked about the public option. And so what does that really mean? Because the healthcare delivery system is so complex, right? So from both of those angles is very interesting, because if you go all the way to one end and say everyone deserves healthcare, and we should all get access to healthcare, there are certain bottlenecks like drug pricing. If you lower drug pricing but increase volumes, right, those business models are not going to be impacted. But we only have so many licensed physicians, and we from a service standpoint, that is a huge issue. And so I think that investors went from thinking that, well, President Trump was a little bit more esoteric, so to speak, right? Like every day you wake up, there's like a headline on Bloomberg and you don't know how to react. And I think people are hopeful that it will be more, like sort of like more gradual change. But I think right now investors are erring a little bit on the too conservative side, where they're not anticipating changes. I would be surprised if there's no drug, pricing legislation coming, or the public option wouldn't be kind of moved forward at a certain pace. But right now we're taking almost like a breather, saying that there's no crazy headlines, and maybe we need to be a little bit more reactive to that and anticipate some of these changes that would happen that might impact valuation of the different subsectors.
Brad, do you see any movement on the prices of prescription drugs during President Biden's term?
Yeah, well, I don't know if this will happen. There's one major thing that I'm worried about. So first of all, I have no worries about President Biden himself. I'm a big fan. I admire the work that he did on the cancer moonshot when he was the vice president. And look, he spoke at AACR when he was vice president. How cool is that we have a president that, values our industry and knows about it enough to have, done that. I worry more about Congress. So I always put out like predictions before the year starts. And one of my top predictions was march-in rights. So if listeners haven't heard that term before, march-in rights essentially is a mechanism that the government has where if it has contributed to research in the past of a particular drug, then it can essentially cancel out the IP of that drug and allow another manufacturer to make it for free or for very low cost or something. And at the end of the last at the end of the Obama administration, when it was a Democratic president and Democrats had a lot of power in Congress, you saw this become a news item. So like, for example, Bernie Sanders proposed implementing march-in rights for Xtandi, a prostate cancer drug that's really like a mainstream drug. So I really worry about that as an investor, because whenever someone proposes march-in rights, they always, say this is a very unique situation. It's only one drug for this one reason, but IP is the lifeblood of our industry. And I feel as an investor, if you cancel out the IP of one drug, then as an investor, you lose confidence in the IP of all other drugs. And so that's the number one thing that I try to think of like a black swan event. I think that something like march-in rights could have like a chilling effect on our industry. And so I would watch, maybe not necessarily President Biden himself, but I would watch if things like that start to gain more traction when you have, this party having more control than they've had in the past. So watch the progressive, end of the spectrum, I would think, to see if some of those types of things start to creep back in the news again.
Brad, would that be enough to shift investor or industry support? Seemingly had been pretty enthusiastic about the incoming administration. Would this be enough to change?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anything that's actual government controlled prices, and that's really what that is something that no matter who the president is, that's a very serious thing for our industry. And so I think that, President Biden and the new administration have a lot of goodwill built up. Everyone's cheering for for their success. But if some things can be taken too far, and this industry has one of the most forceful lobbying groups of any, and so if something like that came up, you would certainly see a lot of backlash.
One of President Biden's early announcements was the naming of Eric Lander, the head of the Broad Institute, as his as his science advisor, and elevating that job to cabinet level. What's your take on that appointment? And is industry as enthused as we saw academics being judging from the Twitter feeds?
I don't have a particular opinion on that appointment. I think that I agree with Brad that I think the administration brands itself and follows the rule that it's going to be a science-led administration. So that in itself is very exciting. But like Brad and I just alluded to, that they have also put out feelers talking about drug pricing, and if you want the volume of patients to expand, drug pricing has to come down. Clearly, there's a dichotomous ends of if you're extremely innovative and you're just out to market. Again, you have a lot of leverage, right? There's a new treatment and it changes the disease course. You're not going to be as impacted, but a lot of biopharma companies have these older, drugs that have been on the market for 10, 15 years. And so, and a legislation there on how much you can charge on these multi-billion-dollar drugs, could that dampen investor interest? So I think that they are right. They are cognizant of, how their tone and how they treat, the way they deal with companies could impact innovation. But I think that they're also thinking about how do we curb healthcare costs to a reasonable inflation.
Great. John?
Yeah, I just want to pick up, Brad, you were talking about the valuations of CRISPR companies. One constant I've seen over the 30 plus years covering biotech is that with every promise, there's the hype. When I first started reading press releases, I'd never seen them. It took me about a year to learn how to tease this all out. In fact, we used to have a couple of headlines every year, hope versus hype. So that goes on. With that in mind, can either one of you, are there a couple of areas in biotech that are kind of flying under the radar that aren't getting the attention that should be getting in the press, that do hold some promise and maybe not being talked about at cocktail meetings and JP Morgan meetings? Is there anything out there we're not seeing?
Charmaine?
Yeah, no, thank you, Brad. So I guess I follow the entire healthcare industry. So I would say when you first asked that question, more mundane things come up. I would think about antibodies for indications for animal health instead of just human. We talk about atopic dermatitis a lot from Sanofi and Regeneron, there are small companies like the Kindreds or, the Elancos in the space, I think that's basically animal health development is a little bit, from a biologic standpoint, is 10, 20 years behind humans. And it's a little bit of a wait and see approach, not because investors don't believe in the value proposition. It's just that the market has not been formed yet. We don't know how much you can charge for this, and pet insurance is a different angle, right? It's not as robust, how are we going to monetize these assets? And then I think that over the last 2 to 3 years, just because there's so many IPOs coming, investors are inundated. Some of the more mundane technologies, a small molecule can still be really exciting, if it's a targeted therapy, and people might not be, or oral chemotherapy, right? That's something that some other crops of companies have tried, and there is a distinct, really easily understandable value add to why that might be a good path. But because it is not gene editing, because it is not CRISPR, it is not CAR T, investors are kind of I don't have time for this. So I would say, the older technologies, the more mundane business models can be good investment opportunities.
Brad, you seeing that?
Yeah, I think the one that I would highlight is just antibody engineering in general. Antibody engineering is getting really good. And in some ways, it's very simplistic. One thing we're seeing a lot is FC region enhancement. There's a company that just had a HER2 drug, margetuximab, that was approved by FDA that it's basically a better Herceptin because its FC region has been enhanced and how it interacts with the immune system. And what you're seeing with bispecifics, T-cell engagers, things like that, antibody engineering is getting really good. And, it's based off of decades of science that has improved over time. And I think there's some drugs out there, some of which that are already approved and others that are in the pipelines that that are kind of flying under the radar. I think sometimes we don't appreciate how good antibody engineering is getting.
Okay, thank you. Alex?
Sure. Let me just bring Kevin in for
thanks, Alex. I'm looking at the questions that are pouring in from the audience. I'm going to rattle off a few of them and then invite Charmaine and Brad to pick whichever one they want to talk about. Everyone wants to know what the next hot area is going to be. Nikki, so let me read a string of these questions. They're all one-liners. What's the area in immuno-oncology are you most bullish for in solid tumors? What are your thoughts on microbiome therapies? We haven't talked about that. What do you find exciting in the stem cell arena? John asks. And Stefan wants to know, what do you see any healthcare or business potential to viral delivery therapies? So which one of those would you like to chat about, or something else?
Brad, you have anything?
I'll jump in. I'll highlight. I'll actually, in like a lightning round, answer three.
Yes.
Microbiome, I think, is compelling but overhyped.
Okay.
Stem cells, I think, has been overhyped for decades, and I'm very skeptical about stem cell treatments. And then on immuno-oncology, one thing that's really exciting that's not getting the credit it deserves is, for the last 4 or 5 years, we've done the checkpoint combo thing. Like you've heard, like throwing spaghetti against the wall, and nothing has stuck because none of it was rationally designed. When the PD-1s worked, we had all of these drugs that already existed and said, if we just combine them with PD-1s, it'll be even better. The only thing, it was a huge bust. The only thing that worked really was chemotherapy and PD-1s. But for the first time ever, for the work that's been happening for the last few years, like the actual science of rationally designing things and our better understanding of the immune system is starting to work. So CD47, Gilead bought a company this time last year for $6 billion. I think you're going to see a lot of deals in the CD47 space. You're seeing things like TIGIT, that's a little more controversial, but like is starting. So anyway, I think that what we were excited about 4 or 5 years ago with the checkpoint combo thing, I think is actually starting to come to fruition these years later, and may actually get really, really good over the coming years because it's more based on, actual science than it was back then.
Great. Charmaine?
Yeah, I would agree 100% with what Brad said. I think immuno-oncology sort of, I think the confidence in, what are these targets, whether it's 41BB or OX40, which has fallen by the wayside to TIGIT, it's not necessarily that the targets are not the right scientific rationale, is, the construct and obviously toxicity when you combine these. And so, we were throwing spaghetti at the wall and we don't even know whether the spaghetti has expired or not, or whether that's the right type of spaghetti that would stick. And now we're saying spaghetti doesn't work. So I think it's interesting that, people are being much more diligent about, sort of like, where did we go wrong? The experiment was wrong. Like, how can we improve on it? And, Merck KGaA has a TIGIT, like TGF beta trap, has a TIGIT, and they have a TGF beta trap. And TGF beta biology has been talked about for a really, really long time, but, they are on the cusp proving whether that would be a new, immuno-oncology cancer drug for, not for lung, their trial failed in lung, but, in bilateral thyroid cancer or in ovarian cancer. So I would say immuno-oncology is sort of, I think there's a lot of progress being made, but people, again, the expectations curve was just too steep. I think with microbiome, I think the concept is sound, but again, because drugs only work if you pass a very stringent clinical trial, and that by definition is a little bit more amorphous and imprecise, right? So the execution risk there is higher. Again, it's not a scientific concept risk. And then so I have the same sentiment as Brad, where it's not that we're not honing in on the right concepts, but it's either the variation or the variability that we have to be more mindful of and keep expectations much more gradual.
Okay, well, we not a lot of time left, but I think I'll try to wind it down with maybe what might be one of the toughest questions. What coming year on will valuations continue to stay high, and will we see the markets respond as enthusiastically? I guess how COVID has reshaped the industry into this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think Brad spoke a lot on this already, but I'll just point out that across all market capitalization in the US, healthcare was one of the best sectors last year, and for obvious reasons, right? Because of and so I think generally would it revert to the mean, and I think on a subsector basis, people think about that medtech did less well last year. Life and diagnostic stocks did really well. Some of the biotechs did really well. Generally, there is some rotation trade going on within the industry. And I think that this year, like Brett and I just discussed, like about drug pricing or, like innovation, I think some of these more political regulatory risks may not be as contemplated as they should. So, I would just, if I have to say like how it would do, I think it would continue to do well, but I would be surprised if it did as well as 2020.
Brad?
Yeah, I've never been more bullish about the long term and never been more stressed about the short term. There's definitely pockets of froth, if not outright bubbles, within biotech. There's actually other parts of biotech that are completely reasonably valued. We've mentioned some of them here that aren't getting the attention that some of the, shiny objects are. And for sure, I think that the bubble is going to deflate. With bubbles, you don't know if it's going to happen tomorrow morning or 6 months from now, but I think eventually it will happen. And one thing I struggle with in my own mind that I don't know is, when that happens, is it going to bring the whole sector down with it, or is it going to be limited to those bubble areas? That I don't know, but the thing that we have going for us, John earlier talked about in the 80s, like we actually remember we had the first genomics bubble when the Human Genome Project happened. And what I would say that we can feel better about today is that if we are in a bubble, it's based off of much better science today. Back then we knew nothing, and if your company name was whatever Genome Inc., you were, your stock went up and you were worth billions, and it wasn't based off of real fundamental science. The things that may be overvalued today are based on real science, and it's just a question of whether there's a little too much exuberance from a valuation standpoint. But the good news is it's on much more of a solid foundation. So wouldn't be surprised if we see a pullback. I expect it to happen at least for certain types of stocks. But the long term of our industry has never been brighter. So I feel good about that we'll make it through it if it does happen.
That's something to end on kind of an upbeat note. And with that, I'll say thanks to Brad, thanks to Charmaine for taking the time and for really discussing well the industry. And thanks also to Kevin Davies and John Sterling for, yeah. So, first, thanks. And so this is Gen Edge Live for now. Looking forward to the next one. We'll keep you posted on our website and on our social media at genengnews.com. Alex Philippidis saying thank you, wishing you a great today and a better tomorrow.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.